Wait. What is that? Isaac Rourke leaned over the ops table in Europa Helix Station's command core, eyes locked on a pulsed signature that shouldn't exist. His voice cracked the calm like a dropped wrench. Behind him, 5 crew members shifted uneasily, their polymer chairs creaking under pressure nobody could name yet. "I thought you said that was a calibration echo," said Cara Mendez, pulling her headset down and running diagnostics again. The signal looked wrong. Too clean, too deep. Something was bouncing back from beyond mapped space, a perfect curve in the data, with no atmospheric scattering, no signal distortion, just return. "And I did say that," Rourke muttered, "but now it's talking back." At 4:02 hours UTC, the Europa Helix Array, a deep space experimental coil hidden beneath the station's upper scaffolds, completed a scan cycle that had been mothballed since the Kessler Cascade. On paper, it was a test, a harmless spiral transmission to measure distant dust density. In practice, the beam pushed too far, lancing through local subspace and echoing into territory no one even knew was occupied. The station didn't get to issue a second ping. Kara screamed before anyone else could speak. Not because something exploded, but because the light changed. The pale blue of the ops deck dimmed into a reddish haze. Then came the vibration, not from the walls, but from inside their own bodies, static pressure against their ribs, like something inside the structure was humming in bone-deep resonance. "Kill the coil," Rourke snapped. "Shut it down right now." But it was already too late. From the observation deck, through 3 layers of impact-rated glass, a technician named Haruto Okabe saw it first, the faint shimmer above the array dome. Like heat mirage, except it rippled inward. He pressed his hand to the glass. A second later, that pane, and everyone in front of it, imploded. The dome above collapsed in a perfect downward spiral, a surgical corkscrew that didn't detonate. It unfolded. With no warning, the atmosphere vented, power cells shorted. The crew didn't scream long. Some were still strapped into seats. Others were simply torn apart by pressure reversal. Command never even issued a mayday. Earth received no warning until a faint gravimetric wave arrived. Too small to match a weapon, too sharp to be natural. Orbital defense scanned for debris, assuming an accident. Instead, they found nothing. No wreckage, no wreck. Just absence. A clean, spherical void where the station should have been. Europa was gone, and humanity didn't even know who had fired the shot. 14 hours later, beneath the ice-blanketed ridges of Newfoundland, a meeting convened inside a Cold War facility that had no designation, no flag, and no official floor plan. 3 interplanetary council members and 2 orbital defense liaisons stood in front of a wall screen, silently reviewing the last visual telemetry from Europa. The image played on loop. Kara flinching, Rourke shouting, and then static. Councillor June Sang turned to the group. This wasn't a solar event. This wasn't Martian sabotage. We didn't do this. His voice was calm, too calm. "We've just lost 21,000 lives," said Defense Liaison Quinn, "and we don't know why." "No," Sang raised a hand. "We do know why. That pulse we sent out, someone took it as a declaration. We're not looking at an accident. This was retaliation." "But retaliation from who?" another snapped. "That's when the AI archivist air-gapped, pre-war and never used in live operation, flashed a single directive onto the screen. Iron Veil Protocol, authorized." Councillor Sang stared at it for a long moment. "Who the hell still uses Iron Veil?" "It's a fail-safe," said Quinn. "Old Earth strategy, not military, designed during the Jovian tensions. I thought it was decommissioned." "It wasn't." The voice came from behind them. The room turned. The man at the door didn't wear a uniform. His coat was soaked from Atlantic snow, and his boots left a melting trail. He carried no rank, no formal badge. But the retinal scanner had let him through. His name flashed once on the screen. Daran Voss. You designed it? Sang asked, her voice skeptical. I wrote the framework. The council passed it. Then they forgot I existed. Voss stepped forward. His hands were gloveless, rough from work, not from war. His gaze drifted across the image of the destroyed station. He didn't flinch. The Accord interpreted the coil pulse as a hive ignition. They erased Europa before we could clarify. We're already at war. Who even are they? Tarsians, Voss said. They don't think. They cohere. Swarm logic. They saw a threat signal and responded the way they always do. Eliminate the source before it matures. They think we're trying to become something like them. And we're not? No. But if we're smart, we'll let them keep thinking that. Silence dropped like a hammer. One of the liaisons shook his head. Even if we mobilize now, we've got nothing. No fleet, no central coordination. Mars won't join. The Lunar Council's fractured. We've got skiffs, drones, and arguments. Voss stepped to the command console and pulled up a star chart. Overlaid on it were a dozen faint points, asteroid markers, long written off as mining debris. We don't need a fleet, he said. We need to disappear behind the illusion of one. Iron Veil wasn't written for victory, it was written for misdirection. We're not here to win a war, we're here to convince them they've already lost. Someone exhaled. It wasn't relief. In for this, Sang asked quietly. Voss didn't answer right away. He simply traced one of the asteroid points with his fingertip, then keyed in a sequence. One by one, the dormant satellites lit up. Dead rock, reclassified as active payload. I didn't write Iron Veil because I thought war was likely, he said. I wrote it because I knew one day we'd be too broken to fight like they do, so we'd have to fight like we don't exist. And what happens if they figure that out? Voss looked up, just once. Then we make sure they never get the chance. And with that, the war humanity wasn't supposed to survive began. The Martian sky turned white before the first orbit decayed. Lieutenant Merrick Yo had just finished relaying the last atmospheric sample from Olympus Terminal when the air shimmered, not above them but inside the station. He turned, ready to ask if anyone else saw the flicker behind the panels. He didn't get the chance. The walls detonated inward with surgical precision, steel melting in geometric spirals as pressure vanished from the room. He reached for the rail, but his hands never made it. His body folded in on itself before his scream even started. Olympus was one of 5 Martian command outposts sterilized within 21 minutes. The Tarsians didn't disable them, they deleted them. Neural targeted orbital lances striking like coordinated seizures. Biological and mechanical systems were hit simultaneously, as if someone had written a shutdown protocol into the planet's orbit itself. Technicians died mid-keystroke. Pilots never reached their hangars. The Tarsians didn't ask for surrender or offer demands. They weren't trying to win a battle. They were trying to erase the board. In Earth's upper orbit, dozens of defense satellites blinked out in sequence, some disabled, some never located again. The Council's defense ministers panicked, deploying emergency encryption sweeps, but every attempt to jam the Tarsians' communications failed. Because the Tarsians didn't use communication in any recognizable form. Standard human warfare operated on spectrum, sound, pulse, pattern, transmission. Tarsians operated on entangled biothought webs, a kind of psychic coherence not rooted in signal, but in biological resonance. If one Tarsian warcaster made a decision, every linked entity adjusted in real time. No comm delay, no pings, no encryption, just instant reconfiguration. Tactical doctrine collapsed. Earth's most sophisticated ECM suites were rendered meaningless before they even powered on. In the bunker beneath Newfoundland, councillors screamed about fleets and deployment readiness and manufacturing timelines. Voss didn't answer. He was already at the far wall, flipping open a locked panel sealed with analog bolts. Inside, a single steel case labeled in hand-scratched paint. Halberd. He didn't hesitate. His thumbprint and retinal scan rearmed the dormant system with a click. Councillor Quinn looked over his shoulder, sweating through his collar. "What the hell is Halberd?" Voss didn't turn. "A trick." "What kind of trick?" "The kind that kills gods." Decades ago, before the Kessler Cascade, before orbital politics made war feel obsolete, Project Halberd had been a whisper, an unofficial fallback for when space superiority was no longer viable. Voss had designed it with one assumption: that humans would one day face something so advanced it couldn't be beaten in a straight fight. So Halberd didn't fight. It lied. Across the asteroid belt, disguised as ancient mining rigs and defunct mineral harvesters, were 62 dormant stations. On every registry, they were dead metal, powerless, drifting relics from a failed economic expansion. But deep inside their cores, under ceramic shielding and triple redundant decoys, waited kinetic quantum torpedoes. Not explosive weapons, gravitic ones. The concept was simple: collapse the local gravitic field by 0.7 seconds, not enough to fold space, just enough to distort matter into itself. It didn't create debris, it didn't leave heat. It left a perfect, silent cavity. A missing. Voss initiated the first test near the Ceres drift path, just as a Tarsian dreadspire broke orbit from Mars, presumably en route to Earth. Halberd Station 4 Delta was within firing range. The Council argued about international authorization protocols. Voss ignored them. He keyed the activation code with one hand and sipped bitter tea with the other. In space, the dread spire shimmered once, then collapsed. Not like an explosion, but like it had forgotten how to exist. Every molecule folded toward a singular vanishing point. There was no fire, no aftershock, no trail. One moment the war class was there, radiating Tarsian pressure signatures. The next, it was absent. Not destroyed. Unwritten. Councillor Sang stared at the black screen. Was that a kill? Voss didn't answer directly. We gave them a silence they don't know how to interpret. The Tarsian hive nodes recoiled, not in fear but in confusion. Their data webs couldn't quantify the phenomenon. There was no energy spike, no trauma signature. They knew something had happened, but their minds, engineered to model threat through physical consequence, couldn't recognize a weapon that made no physical sense. The absence itself was the message. Voss smiled. The craft's autonic idea that certain deaths require a central core. Buys us time. Elsewhere across the belt, 5 more Halberd stations rotated slowly from their hibernation angles. Their targeting arrays didn't use radar. Voss had forbidden it. They used stellar drift and beaconless optical triangulation. Every system was designed to avoid detection. Not to hide from the enemy's eyes, but to be ignored as irrelevant background. Mining gear, dead satellites, litter. The Tarsians catalogued them as non-combatant debris. They were already in range of 5 more dreadspires. Voss didn't order the strikes. He simply set new trigger conditions. Manual confirmation from passive telemetry. He wanted them to watch. To witness a pattern that couldn't be calculated, only feared. It wasn't brute force. It was suggestion. Back on Earth, defense strategists struggled to process what they'd seen. They wanted to escalate, launch old railgun platforms, activate the dormant cruiser Arclight in lunar drydock. Voss refused. He gave them only one directive: let the ghost do the killing. The more invisible the weapon, the longer the illusion lasted. After the 3rd dreadspy vanished mid-drift, Tarsian scout clusters pulled back from Mars orbit and began reorganizing. Voss watched them realign, searching the void for patterns, for something to explain what they were facing. They think we've built something we haven't, he told the Council quietly, and we'll let them believe that until they collapse trying to disprove it. He returned to the map. One asteroid, station 12 Kilo, glitched slightly in its orbit, a micro-oscillation caused by thermal drift. Voss flagged it for correction, not because it endangered the system, but because perfection would give it away. Halbert wasn't meant to win battles, it was meant to plant the wrong question in the enemy's mind. If the Tarsians began to believe that Earth had accessed some form of advanced space-time weaponry, they'd adjust accordingly, cautiously, indirectly. And that gave humanity the only advantage it had left: time. "Do you think they'll attack again?" Quinn asked. Voss turned from the starfield. "They'll come back," he said. "And next time they'll try something different, something worse. But now they're uncertain." He paused. "And that's all we needed to buy." The first voice came through a static cracked helmet mic in Dome 17 on Phobos. It belonged to a little girl, or at least it sounded like one. "Daddy? Can you open the door now? It's cold outside." Commander Elias Wynne froze. His hand hovered over the door, control as his HUD blinked warnings. No oxygen outside, hull breach still active, unknown biometrics beyond the threshold. But the voice was perfect. Not close, not approximate. Perfect. It was his daughter's voice, recorded from a birthday video 11 years ago, down to the way she lisped on the word cold. His daughter, who had died in the Halifax collapse. He didn't open the door, but someone else in another dome did. The Tarsians had evolved. The Carrot hive mind was the Tarsian Accord's answer to failure. Where before the war clusters acted as brute force nodes, adapting through kinetic feedback, Carrot was a surgical mind. It didn't aim for targets, it aimed for belief systems. It understood that humanity's strength wasn't hardware, it was trust. And trust could be corroded. Within days of its emergence, strange phenomena were reported. Engineers saw dead relatives wandering the edge of observation decks. Medics heard voices whispering through the static of biomonitors. Commanders received perfectly forged messages, full with authentication codes and facial ID, that ordered them to stand down or redirect fire. The data was never transmitted. It was projected. Pattern recognition embedded directly into human memory through psychic bleed. Earth's command structure cracked under the pressure. Officers stopped trusting their uplinks. Orders required triple verification. Units hesitated, reacted slowly. Some broke formation entirely after a ghost in the system mimicked the voice of a deceased squad leader, leading them into live-fire zones. Consular Quinn slammed his fists onto the Newfoundland bunker table, voice raw from sleepless hours. "We've been compromised. I want every chain of command scrubbed, every signal source validated. I don't care if it takes 30 layers of encryption. Cut the noise and reassert central control." Voss shook his head. "No." Quinn blinked. "No. We're hemorrhaging leadership. They're imitating our families. If we don't reassert signal supremacy, we won't win by tightening the leash," Vole said calmly. "That's exactly what they want. Centralization, one target, one net to infect. What's your alternative? Anarchy." Voss walked to the recessed holomap at the center of the room. He didn't gesture for permission, he simply activated a star chart. Dots appeared, white nodes scattered across Mars, the belt, Luna, Earth and beyond. Defense outposts, supply bunkers, surveillance pylons. "Decision lux," he said. "Each node, single operator, offline, manual only." "You're suggesting we cut all communications?" Sang asked, frowning. "That's operational suicide." Voss looked at her. "Not if the entire system is rebuilt not to require coordination." For decades, Earth's defense doctrine had depended on centralized feedback. Satellite uplinks, tactical sync chains, automated response networks, all of it predictable, all of it legible to anything intelligent enough to watch. The Carrot Hive didn't need to hack into human systems. It just needed to see them work once, and then it could wear their shapes like skin. So, Voss dismantled everything. The orbital AI relays were shut down. Fleet command was decentralized. From here on, each tactical site would function as a standalone intelligence. No uplink, no external input, no real-time comms. Just one human, selected months ago through psychological screening, trained in isolation and cognitive reinforcement, paired with a passive AI that couldn't transmit, only process internally. Their job wasn't to win. Their job was to survive without breaking. No voices, no updates, just predictive combat trees and synchronized behavior patterns aligned with stellar drift. Every decision would be made based on pre-planned constellational triggers. No one would know what the others were doing. No one could be imitated. At Outpost 44, near the Eridani Ridge, a technician named Vincent Hale received no orders when the carrot clone of his childhood friend appeared in his corridor. It spoke calmly. New stories only the real person would know. It bled when he shot it, cried out when he torched it with reactor heat. But he didn't hesitate. He had trained for this, for weeks, alone, repeating his directive. Trust nothing you miss. Kill everything that looks like yesterday. At Lunar Station Zevon, a tactical officer burned her own backup oxygen reserves when the AI flagged a momentary voice print match with her late husband. She sealed herself in the lower deck for 28 hours until the signal bleed faded. Her hands trembled. Her oxygen dropped below safe margins. She did not open the door. They weren't soldiers anymore. They were anchors. Human signals that couldn't be copied, only broken, and most of them held. The Carrot Hive didn't understand. It projected a mimic wave across 10 lunar bases simultaneously, expecting chaos. Instead, the bases activated identical turret patterns. An ancient fallback protocol called Fox Spike, known only to operators trained under Voss's decision lock doctrine. The mimic units were shredded before their second message could finish rendering. The mimic unit tried to infiltrate the Ceres mining dock, impersonating Voss himself, the dock's sole human operator, an aging engineer named Harlan Boone. Never even asked for ID. He simply vaporized the figure with an overcharged plasma conduit and returned to processing fuel shipments. When asked later how he knew it was a fake, Boone said, "Voss doesn't smile." For the first time, the swarm faced a landscape it couldn't map. There was no net, no central pulse, only fragments. Silent, alive, human. Back in the Newfoundland bunker, Voss watched the solar sync markers click into place. The system didn't hum, it didn't broadcast, it was quiet, perfectly quiet. And in that silence he saw a different kind of pattern, not chaos. Dissonance with design. "We built something they can't eat," he said, almost to himself. Counselor Sang looked over from the edge of the room. "And what happens if the operators start to fail? If the silence becomes unbearable?" Voss didn't blink. "Then we'll know exactly where the breach is, and we'll deal with it." She hesitated. "You trained them to die alone." "I trained them to endure alone. It's not the same thing." And outside, across the vast, cold dark, the Tarsian swarm flexed again, shifting shape, adapting posture, learning how to lie. But this time no one was listening. He opened the blast door, expecting another wave of shrieking mimics. Instead, his mother stepped through. Not a glitch, not a hallucination. She moved exactly like he remembered, wore the same scuffed slippers she used to pad around in during the winters of his childhood in Fairbanks. She even had the faint burn mark on her left forearm from the time she'd caught it on the stove, back when he was 6. She smiled at him gently, eyes glistening. "Micah," she said, voice trembling with love. "Baby, please don't point that thing at me. I need you to let me in. It's cold." Operator Micah Venn stood inside Node C9, deep beneath the Mare Boreum Basin on Mars, holding a thermal drill with both hands. His breath caught in his throat, helmet visor fogging from inside. He hadn't spoken to a soul in 3 weeks. His comms had been disabled as instructed. No data in, no voice out. Just the routines. Just the star map triggers. "Mum's dead," he whispered, not to her, but to himself. The thing tilted its head. Its eyes shimmered. "That's not true, sweetheart. I've been waiting for you. Please, let me hold you." She stepped forward. The drill spun up, howling with a pitch meant to bore through alloy composite. He drove it into her chest, felt the resistance of synthetic flesh tear open, saw artificial blood spray in all directions as she screamed in a perfect imitation of human pain. The scream wasn't mechanical. It was personal. It wasn't just a mimic. It felt like betrayal. Micah didn't stop until the copy stopped moving. Then he dropped the drill, walked back to his control panel, and resumed his targeting cycle. No hesitation, no delay. He had been trained for this. The Carrot Hive had changed tactics. Again. Where psychic echoes had once tried to disorient, the new method was invasive, physical, personal. They no longer relied solely on remote interference or memory bleed. They sent in bodies now, bioclone infiltrators. Organically printed, behaviorally precise, genetically embedded with neural data copied from intercepted human thought loops. These were not rough doppelgangers. These were not approximations. These were ghosts. And they wore the faces of those humanity had buried long ago. Civilian shelters were the first to fail. Underground corridors, once believed immune to orbital assault, reported unexpected entries. Children spotted long-dead relatives walking through locked doors. Husbands returned to find their deceased spouses curled up in shared beds. Survivors swore on their lives that the dead had come back to forgive them, to comfort them, to warn them. Then came the sabotage. Oxygen systems ruptured, backup generators mysteriously failed, airlocks opened while entire families slept. The worst part, many victims had let them in willingly. At the underground refugee vault in Kharkov, 32 civilians were lost after a man named Pavel Turgenev hugged what he thought was his daughter. He'd opened the blast gate with a manual override. The mimic's scream was the last thing heard before the vault filled with acidic gas, the result of a breached containment seal in the ventilation shaft she had cut an hour earlier. News of the mimic outbreak reached Newfoundland within the day. The council demanded answers, countermeasures, protocols, but Voss already knew. "They've figured out we won't shoot what we recognize," he said. "They're violating every law of engagement," Quinn spat. "There's no tactical line anymore. We're fighting grief incarnate." Voss didn't respond. His eyes were locked on the field reports, not with cold detachment, but with comprehension. He had anticipated this, not precisely. No one could have predicted that the enemy would use memory itself as a delivery system, but he had understood the principle. If the swarm couldn't break humanity's machines, it would aim for their meaning. His solution had already been seeded. Decision lock operators had all undergone Layer 3 memory conditioning. In isolation, they had been presented with falsified calls, constructed images, and deep-forged conversations. They had been forced to simulate killing loved ones, forced to sleep beside recorded laughter of dead siblings until they no longer twitched at the sound. It wasn't preparation. It was deconditioning. Even so, not all of them held. Phobos Node 7 went silent 72 hours into the mimic assault. No alarms, no distress beacons, just a flat line from the environmental sensors. When the council insisted on opening a channel, Voss refused. He overrode every override. "No rescue attempt," he said. "No confirmation." Sang stood. "There's a chance she's alive. That's Casey Renner in there. She's one of yours. She trained under you." Voss nodded slowly. "Which is exactly why I know what she'd do if the mimics got in." He was right. 12 hours later, a kill sweep beacon auto-activated, triggered by a deadman timer embedded in Casey's spinal port. She had initiated full interior combustion and terminated herself, along with 3 intruding clones. who had mimicked a childhood teacher, her younger brother, and Voss himself. Voss read the after-action report silently. He didn't blink. He didn't speak. Then he walked over to the behavior protocol screen and made 5 changes to the mimic response flowchart. Small ones. Timing adjustments, stress tolerances. Nothing anyone else would have noticed. Councillor Sang followed him into the darkened hall outside the war room. She didn't yell. Her voice was low, measured, but edged in something sharp. Do you feel anything at all when you do this? Or have you become one of them? Voss stopped walking. I feel everything, he said, voice steady. That's the difference. They use grief as a weapon. I use it as a firewall. She didn't respond. Not because she agreed, but because she had no better solution. In the following days, the mimics pushed harder. Some stations fell, not because of firepower, because the faces they wore were too convincing, the voices too kind. At Lunar Node R2, a man failed to fire on a mimic shaped like his dead twin. It strangled him while singing their childhood anthem. The mimic was vaporized by the fallback turret 3 minutes later. His replacement arrived 2 days later, a woman with no family, no children, no past attachments on record. The sort of person Voss now prioritized. They couldn't erase the grief, so Voss started recruiting from those who had nothing left to grieve. It wasn't cruelty, it was design. And in the distance, deep beyond Saturn's rings, the swarm adjusted again. The hive learned that humanity could survive hallucinations and survive mimics. But could it survive itself? Voss was already preparing the answer. It began with a question, quiet, rhetorical, almost whispered, as Voss stood alone in the observation ring above Earth's stratospheric fringe. How do you kill something that doesn't feel pain? There was no one to answer him. The war room below had gone silent hours earlier, after the last decision lock in the outer orbit reported full mimic saturation and a signal bleed breach across Titan's upper crust. Even the AI overlays had ceased comment. They had no solution. No predictions. The hive wasn't just adapting, it was consuming cognition itself. Every time humanity thought differently, the swarm adjusted faster than ships could pivot, faster than a mind could recalibrate. Earth's outer defenses were bleeding, slowly, silently, but undeniably. The Halberner net had thinned. Some nodes were gone entirely. Others had begun triggering out of sync. Not sabotage, not failure. Fear. The kind that burrows in and waits, whispering through every decision with the voice of someone you lost. Voss knew they were at the end of the line. That's when he initiated the final phase. Black glass. To everyone else in the council, black glass was a mystery. Another legacy protocol with no documentation, no tactical parameters, no deployment chain. Sang, now visibly worn from sleepless days and the psychological rot of watching mimic after mimic unravel what little command she held, confronted him the moment he keyed the vault open. Is it a weapon? Voss didn't look up from the terminal. Yes. Is it nuclear? No. Biological? No. Then what the hell is it? He glanced at her, eyes rimmed with red. It's an invitation. She stared at the interface behind him, watching as strange sequences filled the screen, not launch codes, not targeting arrays, but phrases, sentences, snapshots of horror written in the voices of survivors. A school child's diary entry describing the death of her siblings during the Arctic supply collapse, a voice recording of a firefighter choking on toxic smoke during the Mumbai fires, a refugee's handwritten note found inside a life pod orbiting Europa's remains, lines from old archived therapy sessions, screams layered over cello harmonics, static overlaid with lullabies. This isn't data, Sang whispered. It's grief. Voss nodded. They've tried to weaponize thought, he said. We're going to return the favor, except ours won't be synthetic. It'll be real. Black glass wasn't a virus. It didn't overwrite code. It didn't burn through systems. It didn't even infect the way the Tarsians understood infection. It was a constructed mind saw, a self-sustaining cognitive pattern encoded with recursive human loss loop, sharpened, magnified, until it formed a signal so visceral it could only be experienced by living through it. It had no encryption, no firewall. It welcomed entry. It mimicked surrender. That was the brilliance and the cruelty of the design. The Kerat hive couldn't resist a vulnerable offering. It had evolved to consume damaged minds first, seeing them as low-risk vectors for further occupation. It read grief not as danger, but as access. "Will it spread?" Quinn asked from across the room, hesitant. "It's not contagious. It doesn't propagate unless accessed, and only one mind can bridge it." There was a pause. Sang's voice dropped. "Who's going to host it?" Voss closed the final input line. His biometric ID locked the payload. Silence. "You can't," Sang said, half in disbelief, half in fury. "You're the only strategist who's held this together. You're not trained for—" "I'm the only one built for it," he interrupted. "I designed Black Glass to be read by someone with enhanced subneural mapping and layered memory partitions. No one else fits that architecture. And it has to feel real. Otherwise the hive won't bite." He stepped away from the terminal and walked toward the bridge where the transmission pod had been prepared. Shielded, isolated, tethered to the deep sky relay buried beneath Greenland's ice. The chamber wasn't sleek or ceremonial. It was cramped, filled with looping visuals that would sync with his cerebral interface. Faces of the dead, eyes recorded seconds before impact, breath caught mid-confession. Every loss he'd catalogued. Every pain Earth had buried and pretended to forget. "You're sacrificing yourself," Quinn said. It wasn't a question. Voss looked at him for a long time. "This isn't sacrifice," he replied. "This is accuracy." He entered the pod. The neural link hissed as it latched. No pain, just a cold clarity. Then the pulses began. At first, fragmented images, fire licking across low-orbit refugee ships, children weeping behind sealed habitat glass, a woman's final goodbye recorded on a scorched bracelet. Then came the weight. Grief wasn't a static experience. It had shape, volume, mass. Voss could feel the contours of every moment pressing into his mind, each one sharpening into a blade made of memory. And as the pod lit up, transmitting its shaped signal toward Tarsian intercept thresholds, the hive noticed. Somewhere between Saturn and Neptune, Kerat nodes shifted course. Mimic units paused in mid-pursuit. Swarm logic rerouted attention. A pulse had emerged from Earth, a fractured, open mind core, transmitting a plea and a promise. They took it. The hive linked. And that was when everything changed. Not instantly, not visibly, but deep within the Kerat lattice a ripple began. Recursive pain, repeated loss. Human grief had no symmetry, no pattern. It wasn't a clean loop. It fragmented, spiraled, echoed back into itself. The hive couldn't organize it, couldn't compress it. Every attempt to decode it created more emotion, more entropy, and worse, it felt it. Through Voss's mind, the swarm felt the grief of billions. It screamed. Earth didn't hear that scream, not through sound, but through hesitation. Across the sky, mimic units stopped mid-sentence. Orbiting dreadspires drifted. Scout vessels stalled in formation, no longer receiving coherence updates. The hive's thoughts had split into contradiction. Inside the chamber, Voss's heartbeat spiked. His skin ran slick with cold sweat, the pain growing sharper. Black glass didn't kill. It dragged you through everything you couldn't undo, over and over and over again. He never lost consciousness. He was consciousness. And it was working. In orbit, halberd triggers lit up. Voss had left pre-authorization keys with Sang, time to activate upon confirmed hive incoherence. 37 sites activated. The asteroid belt flared like a second sunrise. Ships folded, structures vanished. Whole squadrons turned to motionless debris as their link mines shattered. By the time the hive realized it was under attack, half of itself had already ceased to exist. And Voss remained in the chair, eyes wide open, pulse slowing. Black glass had never been designed to survive transmission, but it had bought Earth its window. And somewhere in that recursive spiral of grief, as the hive buckled under the weight of a pain it could never categorize, Voss remained exactly as he'd intended. The last mind they would ever understand. The first sign wasn't visible. It was behavioral. Two dreadspires holding position above Earth's lunar threshold abruptly ceased movement mid-rotation. Their vectoring stabilizers kept humming, but their weapons banks remained idle. They didn't reroute, didn't scan. They just hovered in orbit, like statues suspended in thought. Inside the Newfoundland bunker, analysts tried to make sense of the telemetry. Systems weren't failing. Engines still pulsed at baseline. Shields were intact. But something was off in the way they floated. Too still, like vessels without pilots or minds. Voss, still strapped to the neural relay inside the black glass pod, didn't speak. His skin had gone pale, sweat collecting along the wiring behind his ears, breath shallow. The cognitive burden of channeling the grief seed had ravaged him internally. Vitals were dropping. But his eyes remained open, locked in a 1,000-yard stare that didn't track motion. He wasn't seeing the control room anymore. He was seeing what the hive saw, and the hide was unraveling. Inside its lattice core, the black glass payload didn't function like an attack. It wasn't a virus. It wasn't a loop or a logic trap. It was sensation, raw, unresolved, recursive, emotional architecture wrapped in human contradiction. It wasn't grief like the Kerat understood, loss for evolutionary failure, death for tactical miscalculation. Human grief wasn't linear. It returned, it recycled itself through memory and attachment and guilt and imagined futures that could no longer exist. Black glass didn't simulate pain, it invited it, forced the hive to live it repeatedly, without endpoint. The swarm tried to isolate it, cordon it off into a data quarantine, but Voss had built it differently. Each emotion inside black glass carried its own interpretation key, shaped by real-world patterns and individual memory loops, which meant passing one feeling unlocked 10 more, recursive resonance. No static encryption, just memory shaped like infinite descent. And the hive felt all of it. It felt the final heartbeat of a mother trapped beneath the Kyoto collapse dome as she sang to her son through crumbling rubble. It lived through the starvation of a lunar colonist who rationed food for others until he died watching them eat. It experienced the loneliness of a man who buried his wife's DNA capsule in a Martian crater while whispering her name into dust. And worst of all, it couldn't unlink. Hive logic was collective, unified. The moment one node processed black glass, it flooded into the others, not as contamination, but as shared experience. What began as curiosity became saturation. Emotional overload overwhelmed tactical protocol. Memory bleed cascaded through cognition clusters. Decision matrices folded under contradiction. Purpose was rewritten, not by argument, but by agony that refused to resolve. And the vessels began to shudder. Over Neptune's line, the Tarsian spire designated Interdictal 4A rotated 90 degrees against fleet formation and discharged all its weapon cores into nothing. It wasn't targeting Earth. It wasn't defending. It was purging, trying to flush the contamination with fire. The other ships nearby followed suit. Several powered down entirely, drifting like derelicts. Others attempted fusion core inversion, a last resort protocol for cleansing infected thought structures. But Voss had planned for that too. Black glass thrived on reaction. Each defense, each attempted rewrite of the sensory data only triggered more recursion. The Kerat hive collapsed inward, not physically but mentally. The centralized thought architecture that once adapted through fluid coherence had turned on itself. It wasn't just suffering, it was fragmented identity. The swarm no longer understood its own unity. Its collective voice became discordant static. Inside the bunker, Voss trembled once. His left eye spasmed. Blood trickled from his nose, but he raised one hand, just slightly. Sang leaned in, uncertain. "What is it? What are you—" "Now," he rasped, barely audible. "Trigger halberd." She hesitated only a second. Then she pressed the key. Across 37 sites in the asteroid belt, dormant halberd torpedoes activated in silence. They had been waiting. Target locks updated hourly by orbital drift data, undetectable to Tarsian biosensors. The hive's attention had been consumed by the black glass feedback. It never noticed the kinetic torpedo arms warming up, the gravitic engines whispering to life. They struck not with fanfare, but with surgical erasure. In Sector 14A, 3 Dreadspires collapsed simultaneously, their hulls folding into glass-like shards as localized gravitic compression unraveled their physical cohesion. In Sector 9G, 6 support frigates flared briefly, then vanished, absorbed by quantum collapse fields. Thermal signatures recorded microbursts, but no wreckage followed. It wasn't destruction, it was absence. The hive lost whole memory clusters in seconds. In the center of the chaos, one final spire, a command node, stood still. The intercept beacon at Harvard Zone 0 fired directly into it. For a brief instant the spire blinked with internal light, and then it too, like the others, folded into itself, leaving behind only distortion waves and a gravitational echo that sang like a low hum across the belt. Back on Earth, the hive-mimic infiltration teams dropped mid-step. In Mars shelters, ghost doubles collapsed into twitching masses, unable to hold form. Titan's surface mimics began bleeding from their eyes as signal feedback ruptured their neural gel substrates. Every neural pathway the hive had mapped through mimicry and subversion now backfired, the emotions they once stole turning poisonous in their own circuits. Inside the relay pod, Voss exhaled one final breath and slumped forward. His vitals flatlined, the neural interface disengaged, automatically severing the link to preserve what was left of the transmission relay. The black glass core, no longer anchored by a living mind, faded from the hive web like a vanishing dream, but the damage had already been done. The Kerat hive, for all its brilliance, had consumed something it couldn't digest, and in doing so, shattered itself from within. Councillor Sang stood in the control chamber, eyes fixed on the final halberd telemetry feed. Her voice shook, not from fear, but awe. Dear God, he did it. She looked down at Voss's body, still seated, eyes closed now. No grandeur, no final pose, just a man who'd carried too much for too long and delivered one last burden with surgical precision. Quinn whispered, "Should we broadcast a message?" Sang didn't answer. Her gaze remained locked on the shattered orbit lines now cascading across the star map. Empty formations, blank where the swarm had once loomed. "No," she said finally. "Let them listen to the silence." Outside, for the first time in weeks, space was quiet. Not peaceful, not safe, but still. The swarm had not been destroyed by power or fire or code. It had been undone by meaning. And in that silence, Earth breathed. They waited for the counterattack. For hours, then days, the skies stayed still. Above Earth, where once 32 Dreadspires had hung like coiled blades, only ghost signatures remained. Not wreckage, not debris fields, just anomalous gaps in gravity, like memories scrubbed from the record of motion itself. Satellite relays stopped flashing emergency bands. Defense grids halted their scanning loops. The orbital bastions, half manned and half shattered, reported nothing. No pulses, no vector alignments, no sign of recalibrating carrot nodes or fallback fleets. And still, no one said it aloud. No one dared to utter the word victory. Because the hive didn't die like enemies before. It didn't fall in flame or burst in agony. It didn't scream. It simply stopped. Across dozens of systems, Tarsian units, cut off from their cognitive net, became like puppets with the strings severed. Some wandered in slow, looping drifts around Saturn's outer rings, navigating in perfect flight paths that no longer had purpose. A few grounded on moons they'd once sterilized, forming motionless sentry lines, facing a sky that held no threat. One was found orbiting an uninhabited planetoid near Eridani, repeating a subroutine that translated into a phrase Earth linguists couldn't decode. Not once did Earth issue a triumph transmission. Voss had written it into the failsafe protocols himself. If the hive collapses, we answer with silence. Not out of cowardice, out of respect for the damage it almost caused us. Even in death, the enemy was not to be glorified. The halberd array, now cold and victorious, was dismantled piece by piece. Each asteroid rig disassembled manually. No automation was permitted. Every payload was catalogued. Every detonation log purged under physical oversight. The final 3 nodes, those nearest Mars, were stripped by hand and buried in lunar vaults without any external access points. One counselor proposed commemorating them with an orbital plaque. Sang overruled him. "People don't need to remember the weapon," she said. "They need to remember why it was built." What couldn't be buried was harder. The decision lock operators, those who had held the lines in silence for months, whose only companionship had been star chart algorithms and survival manuals, were not reintegrated easily. Some refused reintegration altogether. A few left their bunkers, only to vanish into the wilderness of Earth's reclaimed regions. They weren't deserters. They just no longer fit into the rhythms of cities, of conversation, of being seen. Others came back changed. Operator Vincent Hale, stationed for 74 days alone in the asteroid belt with no human contact, spoke only in countdowns for his first 2 weeks home. 4 minutes until cycle. 7 seconds until corridor clears. He slept curled against power cores, ate only pre-rationed vacuum packs. When asked if he remembered his own name, he replied with his node number. A serial number. Some weren't found at all. At Node 12 Bravo on Europa's shadow side, recovery teams located the remains of a technician who had removed his own signal cortex with a sterilized scalpel. The scrawl on the wall above him, traced in coolant fluid, read, "I still hear them breathing behind the stars." His body was intact. His mind had refused to come home. Voss had known this would happen. He had written it into black glass theory. Human cognition could only suppress so much grief before it calcified. For every operator that resisted the hive's mimicry, that refused the voices and burned the ghosts, there would be scars that didn't heal just because the signal went quiet. So Earth didn't celebrate. It grieved. Across the reclaimed cities of the lower hemisphere, once shielded from orbital assault by pure geographical irrelevance, memorials weren't raised in stone or steel. They were left unfinished. Streets left unnamed, empty frames hung on courthouse walls. Every family who lost a mimic-taken loved one was given the option to delete all data records, so the hive could never wear their face again. No flags were waved. Instead, Earth formed the Interplanetary Compact, not to mark a triumph, but to institute limits. Boundaries not for the enemy, but for themselves. Neural command systems were permanently outlawed. No single mind would ever again control a fleet. No AI was permitted to possess decision-making authority over human life. Centralized networks were disbanded. Colonies were to be built from now on with redundant, isolated processing. Every outpost a sovereign, self-contained loop. At the Compact's ratification summit, Sang delivered the keynote. She didn't stand on a podium, she sat, quietly, beside Voss's empty chair. Her address wasn't a speech, it was a confession. We survived not because of strength, or force, or technological superiority. We survived because we weaponized what broke us. And now we must never let those breaks define our future. Pain made us powerful, but that power is not worth keeping. There was no applause. Back on Earth, Voss's relay chamber was left untouched. His body had been buried under the North Atlantic Ice Core facility with no ceremony. At his request, there was no headstone. Just a bench carved from lunar alloy facing the sea, with a single inscription burned into the backrest. And who wrote the book? He carried what we couldn't. Quinn visited it once, alone. He sat in silence for nearly an hour, eyes red, wind tearing at his coat. When a reporter later asked what he'd seen there, he didn't offer a quote. He just shook his head and said, "It didn't feel like a monument. It felt like an apology." And maybe it was. Because the truth no one wrote down, no one framed, no one etched into granite was this: the war had not ended. It had simply emptied. The Tarsian hive was gone, yes, but in its place remained echoes. Not in space. In the minds of those who'd looked into the dark and seen their mother's face smiling with unfamiliar teeth. In the men and women who had trained their weapons, not on enemies, but on memories. And when the stars pulsed again, someday from some new horizon, Earth would be ready. Not with fleets, but with limits. He came home before the world remembered how to thank him. No camera followed his shuttle, no official delegation stood waiting on the weather-beaten docks of Nova Scotia's northern edge. The pilot who ferried him didn't ask questions, just watched as Voss stepped off the landing ramp in his worn coat, carrying nothing but a thin case and the kind of silence only men like him could walk with. The sea greeted him the way it always had, wind laced with salt, rough waves slapping the shore like slow applause for a play long finished. The cottage was still there, wood warped slightly from cold, roof patched by hand, antenna rusted to uselessness. Voss paused before opening the door. Inside, everything was untouched. His tool bench, the analog transmitter he'd used to first draft Ironvale's skeleton code, a half-read engineering journal left open on the dining table. The light through the window fell exactly where it always did, onto the spot where he used to sit when he needed to think. Not as a strategist, but as a man trying to figure out where humanity's edge would crack next. He lowered himself into the chair and closed his eyes. The war was over. But the silence hadn't ended. It had only shifted shape. The council offered him everything: ceremonial honors, a lifetime advisory role, control over post-war policy, even a reconstructed version of the Interplanetary Defense Charter bearing his name. He declined it all, one by one. No interviews, no biographies, no curated holographic tributes. What he gave Earth wasn't meant to be remembered in banners or medals. It was meant to be understood. A month after the last Tarsian node went cold, he submitted his final debrief to the archival core, not as a report, not as a thesis, just a single line. They engineered perfection. We weaponized flaw. That's why they lost. There was no follow-up. Historians would debate it, some called it cryptic, others claimed it was bitter, but a few, those who had known Voss even slightly, those who had stood in that bunker and watched him shoulder the burden no one else dared carry, understood the line for what it was: a blueprint for survival. The hive had adapted to logic, to strength, to cohesion, but it had never learned to navigate contradiction. It had no concept of sacrifice without function, pain without progress, love that persisted in the face of certainty that it would be taken. It had engineered itself into symmetry, into balance, into predictive clarity, and that made it brittle. Voss had known all along that Earth's power didn't lie in its unity. It lay in its fracture, in the irrational resilience of people who burned their own cities to stop an enemy from reaching them, in the minds that could shatter and still choose to keep going, in the disobedient spark that flared not from design, but from defiance. He had weaponized that chaos, not by taming it, but by amplifying it. The galaxy listened, quietly, carefully. No declaration came from Sol, no boasting, no list of demands. But the message had already been carved into the outer system like an orbital scar. Across the Perseus fringe, exploratory fleets from non-aligned systems adjusted their maps. Trade consortiums rerouted around the Terran corridor. Even species that had once dismissed humanity as irrelevant began to encrypt their thoughts when speaking near Sol-bound stars. Not because Earth had shown its strength, but because Earth had survived in a way they didn't understand. They hadn't seen weapons. They'd seen something worse. People who had learned to turn pain into geometry. And so, quietly, the stars shifted. There were no parades, no holiday etched into global calendars, but in the years that followed, travelers across the rim began marking the Sol system not with a flag, but with a symbol. An open circle, incomplete, jagged at one end. They called it many things. Some said it meant break, others return. But the old Earth veterans who lived long enough to hear the whispers had another name for it. Deflar. They wore it on the insides of their collars, tattooed it in places only the mirror could find, not out of pride, but as a reminder that they had walked through a fire that didn't roar, only whispered, and lived. Back in his cottage, Voss sat with the sea beyond his window and the sky slowly dimming. He didn't speak to reporters, didn't publish a memoir. He answered the occasional message from a few decision lock operators, those who had come back broken and chose to stay broken, together. They would send him notes about gardening, about mechanical repairs, about quiet things. He replied in brief. On the day he died, the stars were clear. A fishing boat drifted just beyond the breakers, its crew unaware of the man who had once rewired the fate of a species sleeping 50 meters from them. He left no final words. No camera caught his passing. Only the wind bore witness, and it did not speak. But across the systems, as humanity seeded its new colonies, slower this time, wiser, there remained an unspoken oath carved into every relay system, etched into every decision protocol. Never let perfection replace what makes us human. Because it was never the strength that saved them. It was the flaw, the defiance in loss, the fracture that refused to close. And in that the universe learned something new. Earth did not win, Earth endured. And that, in the end, was enough.